Everyone. So last unit we spent a good amount of time talking about light, and I know some of you found it really interesting. And so one of the questions I got on that test over and over again was, how do we make light? Like, how do electrolytes work? When we were discussing light, we talked about how important it was that as all of these discoveries were being made, it really happened when we were starting to be able to make electric light, and that let us investigate light much more easily. And so I wanted to talk about that. I also want to talk about in January, when we talked about energy, we talked a little bit about energy efficiency and some of the ways that we make more energy efficient or less energy efficient lights around our house. And so I'm going to talk today about the three main ways that we make electric lights and uh, how they work from the electrical perspective, and then some of the energy considerations. So the first way we're going to talk about is kind of an oldie but a goodie, the incandescent light. So this is the type of light where, if we think about your light bulb with inside kind of the little filament, and we connect it to a socket, and that socket runs um, electrons up and through this filament. And essentially, what happens for an incandescent light is that it's kind of hard for the electrons to move through that filament. The filament is usually made of tungsten. And so the filament starts to heat up as the electrons move through. You may think of that in like a wire, but certainly, like, as the resistance in a wire gets higher, then um, it starts to give off some heat. And in fact, what happens here is that the tungsten heats up so much uh, that it starts to glow. And so that is where our incandescent light bulbs create light. Now, that being said, it basically means that the heat is sort of like a byproduct. We're not like directly creating light, we're directly creating heat. And as a result, we're getting some light. Um, and that makes it pretty energy inefficient. When you go to the store and buy these light bulbs, you'll often see them classified by their wattage. And so you might see like a 60-watt light bulb. And what that means is that it uses 60 joules each second of energy. Um, it is also a way for us to in some ways classify brightness, because when we were only buying incandescent lights, then that was a great way for us to talk about the brightness, because something that used 60 watts would probably be brighter than something that used 40 watts, but less bright than something that used 100 watts. And so for a long time, we got used to using wattage, which is really about power consumption, as a way of measuring brightness. Turns out that's actually not a great measure of brightness. We have scientific measures of brightness, candelas and lumens and all sorts of fun things. Um, but this is not really the best way. And especially it becomes a problem when we start using other kinds of light. So the next kind of light we talk about is fluorescent. These are lights that nowadays you mostly find in like commercial and industrial spaces. So if you think about like your classroom and you look up and you have those long tubes, those are fluorescent lights. These also had their heyday in domestic lighting. If you remember um the lights that looked kind of almost like an ice cream cone, right? So they had like a twirling kind of tube that went up. Please remember, I didn't go to art school. I went to physics school. Um, those are also a type of fluorescent. Very hard to find nowadays, I would say. Um, but you do get them, you do get them still in commercial areas. You get these long tubes. What's going on in there is that there is a vapor, a gas. And the gas that is in these is actually mercury. And when we pass electricity through the tube, in each of those mercury atoms, they have some electrons, right? And essentially, our electrons are exciting those electrons, kind of making them come up and then fall back down. And in that process, they give off some UV light. Now, we don't see UV light, we're not bees. Um, so that would not be enough for us. But conveniently, the tube is coated in a material that when it's hit by UV light, it glows white. And so, which we call fluorescence. And so that UV light hits the white material and then it fluoresces and we get light that we see. Um, these are very low energy consuming, but they have this unfortunate mercury situation, which means that throwing them away in a landfill results in mercury joining our groundwater. It means that, and this was a big deal when we were looking at these kind of lights that we would use in household fixtures. It means that if you break it in a child's room, that child can get mercury exposure. And so there's a lot of reasons that fluorescent lights are okay commercially and not great in like residential situations. Um, that being said, a compact fluorescent light, so if we were trying to replace a 60-watt light bulb with a small compact fluorescent light, we would be looking at um, something around like 35-ish watts. So for the same brightness, we would end up with fairly low, um, a fairly low consumption of energy. And so that was something that was really appealing. That being said, a lot of people do end up having like they get headaches from these lights. The lights can kind of have sort of like a very gradual strobing or a very small strobing effect that really affects people poorly. Um, so a lot of people don't really like the light that comes from fluorescent lights and isn't something they would want in their home. The last thing, the last type of light that we see, and this has ended up becoming a big deal recently, is the LED, which is short for a light emitting diode. And a light emitting diode is made from something called a semiconductor, which is exactly what it sounds like. It conducts electricity in certain cases. Um, and specifically, what we have, diode means two, right? So on one side, we have what is called an N-type semiconductor, which is where there are a lot of extra electrons in the material. And then on the other side, we have a P-type semiconductor, which is where there are a lot of what we call holes, which is basically just a lack of electrons. And so when we run a current into an LED, what we're doing is encouraging an electron to jump from the N-type to the p-type and fill a hole, right? So we would get fill a hole. And then we will have another one, and we'll fill that hole, and so on and so forth. And every time an electron makes this jump, it also emits light. And based on what materials the p-type and n-type semiconductors are made of, and exactly like how many electrons and how many holes and how big of a jump it is, we are able to control the type of light, so the color, the wavelength, all of that information very easily. And so it means that we're able to have like a blue LED, a white LED, a red LED, and all we have to do is change this material a little bit. So, why don't we use LEDs for everything? Well, originally it was because they were really expensive. And honestly, as we start to discuss trade and some of the tariff situations again, this is something that we want to keep an eye on, because semiconductors and where they are made will determine the cost of LEDs. And if we're paying additional tariffs to get semiconductor materials into the United States to make these, then that could affect how reasonably priced LEDs are. So historically, it was because it was really expensive to make them. Now, obviously, recent situations have come up um, where we are now better able to make semiconductors, right? Like if we think back to like Moore's law, right? This gets into Moore's law pretty well. Um, as we've ramped up production, we've ramped up our technology, we've also made LEDs cheaper to make and smaller. Um, and so now they're much more affordable than they used to be. And we're actually starting to see sort of a flip-flop where it's now becoming more expensive to buy an incandescent light, because we just don't make as many of them. And so LEDs are I would say like winning the light efficiency war. They do make LED lights that look like a standard light, and then here what it is just a bunch of little LEDs. And remember, because we can control the type of light that comes out very easily with controlling the semiconductor, it means we can make them a nice, like glowy, like aesthetic light, or we can make them very bright white or different colors. And in fact, a lot of these actually have arrays of different types of LEDs so that you can basically make like any combination of them. Um, and in terms of energy consumption, I mean, we're looking here at like 10 watts for the same brightness as a 60-watt bulb. So they win the efficiency war for sure. And they last for a very long time. So if we're looking at cost per year of use, they win that argument as well. If we are not thinking, if we're just thinking about how much it costs to buy a single bulb, incandescent may still win that by a hair. Fluorescent has largely lost from both the environmental aspect, the cost aspect, and the lifetime aspect. Very few people are putting fluorescents in their house anymore. LED is largely what people are using if they're using a more efficient light. All right. Thanks so much for listening and learning about lights with me. Have a great day.